This is another video about tenant selection, getting properties managed, and in particular why this sort of thing ensures that you have good tenants placed, something that I've evolved and refined over years. Whether you use a management agency or not, it's one of the most important things in the business. You want consistency and long-term thinking, and one bad tenant can change all of that. There are a number of stories I've heard over the years. For example, there was a landlord who accepted cash in hand off tenants because he was trying to avoid tax. Whatever the reason, he used to collect it, and then he had to go around to do this, and he got into a disagreement with a tenant. This got progressively worse, and then the tenant stopped answering the door. I don't know the full details, but eventually he got the rent he wanted, and then the tenant moved out. New tenants moved in, and after a few months there was a leak from the bathroom into the room below, quite a major leak, and it caused quite a bit of structural damage. But what I think they found was that the prior tenant, as an act of revenge, drilled small holes into the ceiling, and the effect of this would only become apparent months later when the new tenant had moved in and the old tenant was long gone. So this probably cost hundreds if not thousands to fix. So even if you think you've gotten round a problem, then it can cause a bigger problem later on. Plus imagine the time taken, even him having to walk around, collect rent, the tenant wasn't in, he'd have to walk around again or drive round, I don't know how far he lived, and then keeping tabs on things like this. Imagine if he'd wanted to get the tenants evicted, what proof would he have had that they even paid rent if he was just collecting in cash? You have to add up the time wasted in all these minor activities that could have been avoided had he placed tenants properly and managed them properly. You think you're saving money at the start, or even if this tenant was paying in cash for 3 years, yes, maybe you're avoiding tax, but it can take just one jealous friend to report you to HMRC, and HMRC's systems are becoming more advanced all the time. I'm sure they probably have ways of picking up this kind of activity now, and these things from their end will only ever improve. So this landlord probably saved on tax, but whatever he saved, he probably wasted even more in time and then in reparations after he had to fix the leak. Similar to me, my parents decided to get a property about 10 years ago. It was quite a good property, the area was relatively nice, but they just chose an agent who was very substandard because they believed they could trust him, because my dad used to know his dad, but they turned out to be very corrupt. They didn't have a good reputation, people didn't have good things to say about them. God knows what kind of checks they did on tenants before bringing the tenants into the house. I don't think they did any, but we only found out months later by speaking to a neighbour that the whole street was scared of them. People were jumping in and out of the windows at night. They were assumed to be drug dealers. In the end they just vanished. They owed rent, but they simply weren't there. We had to go around and clean up. They left all kinds of junk behind. Again, it's an example of using a bad agency. They didn't place the tenants properly, they caused us months of stress and disturbed the whole neighbourhood, and in the end we had to spend time going round and fixing everything. It's because of this experience my parents actually sold this house, which obviously is something you should never do. Had they approached the correct agent or a good agent at the start, this problem would never have existed. And from this, people assume that because they've had this one bad experience, this whole part of the city must be quite dodgy and bad and only fit for bad tenants, which is why property doesn't work in their minds. But nothing could be further from the truth in this case. I had another tenant who was placed by this agency, and he was always a bit shifty. He was late for rent, sometimes didn't pay rent. This went on for months, and then one day he disappeared because we weren't getting formal reports from the agency. We were keeping tabs on rent, and by the time he disappeared, we'd worked out he'd owed £2,000. Then we had to find out where he worked. I got my friend to phone up his office to confirm I recognised his voice. We had to take him to court. I had to take time out for my PhD, come from London to Coventry, take him to court, go to court, and he doesn't turn up. So imagine the time and money wasted in that instance. There was another tenant sourced by this agent. I don't know why we didn't learn sooner, but it just shows we didn't know the right people at the time. So this tenant lived in my property and he was okay for a while, but then started making all kinds of demands for furniture, and we actually ended up supplying the furniture, although we weren't contractually obliged to do this. We didn't know that at the time, so we did it, but then he wanted us to build the furniture, and then we noticed things were broken in the house. We used to go around, we didn't know about the 24-hour notice thing. Eventually we could get in, which was obviously even more of a waste of time, and again after a while he disappeared and stolen all the furniture. Another example of a tenant who wasn't sourced or checked properly in any way and stole our goods and left. There was another group of tenants who moved in, paid rent for a while, but then stopped paying rent. They started arguing with us, and then one day they disappeared. We went round, they left all their things there. They were there for some weeks, so we waited some weeks for them to return to collect their things. So imagine the lost rent in that time, what could have been done in order to get the new tenants in. All that time was wasted and lost, so we eventually had to remove the items ourselves. Another tenant we had was quite good and he was paying rent for quite some time, but then whenever we'd interact with him, we noticed he was a bit off or despondent, got into disagreements with him because we were asking for rent because it was self-managed, and he kept telling us he had paid the rent. So this caused delays delays in rental and arguments between ourselves and the tenant. We only learnt from someone else in the agency that when he'd moved out, he was paying the agency, for example, £1,000 a month, but the agency were only paying us £900 a month, and there was no management service involved. So the agency were secretly pocketing £100 a month, and this is why there was tension between ourselves and the tenant. In one of the cases, we asked for the deposit back to claim the damages, but the agency claimed that their office computer had caught on fire and that this would not be possible. It seems ridiculous to think back that I even had these problems back then, but it shows you don't know what you don't know. Nowadays, these kinds of issues would be unimaginable, as everything's done in accordance with process and procedure. After this, I discovered one or two agencies that would at least place good tenants, but some of these tenants, upon leaving, as I didn't know the laws, I would go to the property and start cleaning it and doing the gardening. They didn't maintain the garden, so we had to do digging for the weeds, do the lawn. One of the houses had potatoes popping out everywhere. These all had to be dug out. We did some of the repainting ourselves. We were touching up parts of the property. I'm not a painter, so we didn't really know how to do it to the correct standard and just did it to passable standards. But even then, this comes back to haunt you later on when new tenants moved in and they wanted the paint work to be done properly. In certain contexts, damage can occur, and as with my social housing properties, this is part of the contract, so it can be a big risk. In terms of social housing, I've been doing this for about 2 years. In most cases, it's worked very well, but I had one tenant who destroyed the toilet basins, destroyed the doors, the bed, smashed windows, and then just left, and I had to pay to get this repaired. There are many social housing providers wherein you don't have to pay for the repairs, but the specific contract that I have requires me to do this. This has happened with a couple of properties. I had another one like this where the windows were smashed. But I've done the numbers, and it's important to go back through your transactional history and see if the damages are worth the profit. And overall, for me, it is. These properties are still making more than a standard buy-to-let. But if I were to encounter a few more of these kinds of extreme cases wherein I have to pay for all kinds of damages in my properties, then I may be considering moving back to standard buy-to-lets. So if you're considering placing your own tenants and doing it yourself, make sure you do credit checks, employment checks, their salary covers the rent. There are a number of other checks you can do, but I don't know all of these because I've never had to do this, because I know a good management agency that takes care of all of this, and that's what I would advise you to do. Because even if you come up with a streamlined process wherein you're able to do all the relevant checks, and then you even meet the tenants to see their manner and try to work out whether they're a liability or whether they're a good tenant. Again, this takes a lot of time, and as time is more important than money, it's better just to give all of these tasks to the people with the experience, which are the agencies. I've just had tenants placed in 3 properties. I didn't have to even think about it. They advertised the properties, rented them out. After tenants viewed, they just kept me informed now and then of what I needed to know. For one house, they got 2 sets of tenants and asked me which one I would prefer. I just told them to place the tenant that they believe is least likely to cause any problems. Tenants that seem the most consistent and have a good manner about them, and I left it to them because I trusted their judgment, because they have years of experience of doing this. And in addition to all the automated checks, they then find the good tenants with potential and then reconduct all those tests manually. So they are very thorough, and this is why I believe their arrear cases are less than 1%. So it's another video to remind you that there are people who specialise in all these things that you need to do in order to place reliable tenants, rather than you learning this whole skill set, which can take years to do. It's better just to pay the right people to take care of all of this and avoid these horror stories. Thanks for listening. See you next time.